Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appeared to have a less than edifying visit to New Delhi to attend the high-profile G20 summit, with his government's indulgent handling of the often unvarnished and aggressive pro-Khalistani groups coming under a sharp focus. Reports from Delhi said Trudeau got an earful from his Indian vis-à-vis Narendra Modi over the way his government has been dealing with the separatist Khalistanis. Trudeau looked visibly disengaged in some of the official functions of the G20 summit, which ended for him with a meeting with Modi. The Indian Prime Minister was reported to have taken a sharply unambiguous stand on Canada's Khalistan problem, even as a separatist group called Sikh for Justice held a referendum in the town of Surrey in British Columbia. Trudeau was stranded in Delhi because of his official aircraft developed a technical snag. A chastened Trudeau stuck in Delhi after a tense exchange because of a malfunctioning aircraft with Modi became emblematic of his visit. To understand Canada's and Trudeau's Khalistan problem, Mayank Chhaya report spoke to the well-known journalist and writer Terry Milewski, who has tracked the global Khalistan movement for decades. 2 years ago, Terry wrote a celebrated book titled Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistan Project, to mark the 50th year of the movement's nascent beginnings on October 12, 1971, with an advertisement in the New York Times. Terry Milewski.
Welcome to Mayank Chhaya Reports, Terry. It's a great pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for the invitation.
How do you see the so-called Khalistan referendum by the separatist group Sikh for Justice in the town of Surrey in British Columbia? Yesterday, I thought. Day before.
Yesterday. They're claiming a huge turnout, 100,000, they say. Well, they always say that. You never see a sort of authenticated count. You never see authenticated results. You see usually you see a general statement from the supposedly independent commission that oversees these votes to validate it as a fair vote, but you never see details. Well, so how many voted? And one's tempted to ask sometimes, how many times did they vote? And were they who they said they were? Because if you delve into the details, you sometimes get hung up, for example, on you'll notice that you're allowed to vote if you are a Sikh over the age of 18, and the ID that is accepted includes any other ID. So anything will do. So I've yet to discover how exactly they prevent you showing up with one ID and then circling around and voting again with a different ID. And I do have a friend in London, as a matter of fact, who told me about how he registered to vote online. And when it came to name, he put down Angelina Jolie. And the computer came back, bing, you're registered. Congratulations. Have a nice day. There's room for skepticism about the results, but that's a detail. And the big picture is that the vote in Surrey, which promises to be, even if the numbers are padded, probably the biggest turnout that they've had so far in Canada. There was apparently an overthrow, so now they're going to have a second date. They're milking this for all it's worth. They're spinning it out as long as they can. But here's the main issue. The real story for me is that the referendum leads the Khalistan movement into a brick wall. Here's what I mean. That it is a referendum, after all, of a small minority, the diaspora, of the Sikh people. The 25 or 30 million Sikhs in the world, a couple of million overseas. And Sikhs in Punjab are not voting. Now, that makes the vote just right there irrelevant in terms of making it somehow justifiable to break off a chunk of India and make it into a separate country. But it makes it even more unjustifiable when you look at the support or lack of it within Punjab, where most Sikhs live. For example, if you look at the last couple of elections, you're probably familiar with the figures. The pathetic, the pitiful level of support in a Sikh majority state, 58% Sikh in Punjab. The last election, they got 2.5% of the vote and no seats, except for, of course, for Simranjit Singh Man's federal seat. But no seats in Punjab. And in the election before that, in 2017, they got 0.3% of the vote. Nota, none of the above did better than the separatist splinter group of the Shiromani Akali Dal, Simranjit Singh Man's splinter group, the Sad-A of the Shiromani Akali Dal. So my point is that there is a screaming lack of support. I mean, in the last election, a Hindu nationalist party, the BJP, got far more votes than the Sikh separatists in a Sikh majority state.
Indeed.
So I mean, I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm belaboring this point, but it does seem relevant if we're having a referendum among Sikhs on independence, that no matter how many they get in the diaspora, it's going to be dwarfed by the steadfast opposition going back 30 years now to the high watermark of separatist sentiment when they won quite a few seats in 1989. So if you go back 30 years, it's been a steady downhill slide. There's no interest in this in India. And that's something which I think Westerners watching with anxiety and with interest this referendum process in Italy, in Australia, in Germany, in the UK, in the US, and of course in Canada. They're wondering, well, it seems like a pretty big turnout. Well, no, it doesn't. It's a drop in the bucket. So when I say that they're heading for a brick wall, I mean that eventually, after spinning up, this is referendum 2020, remember. Okay, so COVID interfered. Let's give them credit for that. But here we are getting to the end of 2023 and we haven't finished with it yet. So when are we going to finish with it? Why do all these votes have to be staggered by months and months, and then there's another vote, and then there's another vote? I think they want to delay the outcome because this referendum is a bit like the dog that caught the car. To me, it's okay for the dog to chase the car and bark, bark, bark. But if the dog catches the car, it's going to get run over. If they actually catch the car, if they finish the referendum and they say, look, we've got a huge vote, we're going off to, this is the plan, the Gurpatwant Singh Panun of Sikhs for Justice, having organized the referendum, will then proceed in triumph with the wind in his sails, with this overwhelming vote, he will say, to the United Nations, where he will persuade the United Nations to supervise and endorse a referendum within Punjab. Well, that's the brick wall, isn't it? Can anyone imagine any scenario where the government of India would countenance such a vote? Can anyone see a scenario where there would be an outcry for such a vote in Punjab, where 2.5% of the population showed any interest at all, and that was in a soft option?
No, indeed. No, sorry to interrupt. Forget the government of India. Punjab itself will not entertain this. I mean, it's a delusional exercise, the way it has been carried out over the years. It means absolutely nothing in effective terms.
Yeah, so they've got a problem, and that's why they're delaying the end of the vote. I mean, they're going to keep this going. I mean, it's nice. It fires up the troops. They send in contributions. There's plenty of money coming in to finance another vote and another vote and another vote, but it doesn't lead anywhere. And you're quite right to point out that, I mean, Punjab has been governed by pro-Indian Sikhs for the last 4 decades. I mean, it's something which has somehow escaped observers in the West.
Indeed.
That the whole exercise is abortive. The whole exercise leads us nowhere.
But Terry, even at the height of the insurgency, which I said I covered in the last throes of it, There wasn't anything that suggested that they could get a piece of land they can call Khalistan. It wasn't
No,
just a feasible exercise from any angle. So I don't know why they think it's now.
no, it's a good point. I mean, who elected the Baba Khalsa? Who elected the Khalistan Liberation Front? And nobody elected them. It was never based on popular support. That too is often forgotten. The impression is that there was some sort of uprising on behalf of the Sikhs, and they always pretend to speak for the Sikhs. So that if you disagree, for example, and you denounce Khalistani veneration and glorification of terrorist martyrs, for example, they say, oh, you're anti-Sikh, as though Sikhs in general somehow endorse terrorism, which they certainly don't. They've been its principal victims. There's a reason they refused to support this armed insurgency throughout the 1980s and the early 90s until it was basically crushed, I guess you could say, by KPS Gill in 1993. And I would say that the lack of support is not a recent development by any means. There never was any democratic mandate or any pretense to obtain one. They simply declared, we're going to speak for the Sikhs, whether the Sikhs like it or not. That's what really happened.
Yeah. Perhaps it is fortuitous, but the referendum, so-called referendum, took place barely as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was taking off from Delhi after the technical snag. And in the aftermath of a tense and frosty conversation of his with Prime Minister Modi, how is it being seen in Canada right now? Not the referendum, the fact that he had a bad visit.
Yes, it's being seen as par for the course for a prime minister whose time is up. With the best will in the world, even among liberals, it's seen as the end stage of the Trudeau administration. And the polls have been consistent recently that if there were an election held anytime soon, that the Conservatives would win it, and the Trudeau era would be history. And that's not completely out of the norm in Canada. Prime Minister Harper in his day, he got about 9 years in office before people had enough and wanted a change. Prime Minister Chrétien in his day before that, Prime Minister Mulroney, they all seem to have a span of 9-10 years at the most. And then people would say, okay, we've had enough. We've heard enough from you. Let's try something new. And so it would be no surprise, it'd be completely normal if Canadians turned away from Trudeau. So it's seen, to answer your question directly, through that lens of a prime minister whose day has passed and who has failed on this file, not just recently, but consistently over the years, where the Liberals have benefited, as the Conservatives did before them, to be fair, from the vote bank politics that they've been playing with the Sikh diaspora in Canada. It's a well-organized body. They have basically made a deal in some important swing ridings upon which federal elections tend to turn in Canada, that if you sing our song and you show up at our Vaisakhi parades and look the other way as the pictures of gun-toting assassins and martyrs and mass murderers goes by on the parade floats, then in return, we can organize 10,000 votes for you, because they'll vote the way that the big shots, that's us, at the Gurdwara, tell them to vote. Right. And if you don't sing our song and you speak against us, then you can kiss goodbye to your parliamentary seat. Well, if you believe it, it's true, isn't it? I mean, if you get scared, even if you're wrong to be scared and you overestimate their influence, right, but you respond by, as I say, singing the Khalistani song, then they've won, haven't they? So that's been going on, and Trudeau has been responding to that pressure. As I say, not to say that the Conservatives didn't in their time, And of course, we have to remember that, as many of your listeners will know, the Trudeau minority government in Canada is sustained by the votes of a left-wing party, the NDP, a minority party, which is led by Jagmeet Singh, who is a longtime Khalistani sympathizer, beyond a question, and who, when he first won the leadership of his party, happened to be on a show that I was anchoring, a political show on the CBC, and I asked him 5 times in a row if he would denounce the martyr posters of the Kanishka bomber, the Air India bomber of 1985, Talvinder Parmar, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history, who is honored with a life-size martyr picture on the outside of an important Gurdwara in Surrey, British Columbia. And he didn't want to go there. He ducked the question 5 times in a row, and eventually conceded 5 months later, under pressure from within his own party, that yes, Parmar was indeed the author of that terrorist atrocity, which killed 331 people. So you see my point, that
Right.
there is, Trudeau's not in a hurry right now with these polls saying he's going to lose to precipitate an early election by driving out of it's not really a coalition, it's an agreement with the NDP party led by Jagmeet Singh.
Right.
So this is the lens through which Canadians are seeing the news from New Delhi today.
I see. Yeah. Do you think Trudeau is driven to sacrifice good relations with India at the altar of domestic political expediency?
I don't think he knows that's what he's doing.
Oh, right.
I think, yes, I think he just doesn't get it. I'm not just guessing. I worked on a story, for example, when he was first running for office. I'll try to make the story short. In brief, there was a contest for the nomination to run for the Liberal Party in the riding of Vancouver South. Long-time riding held by a well-known Liberal, Ujjal Dosanjh, the most successful Sikh politician of his generation in Canada, former First Minister, if you will, or Premier in Canadian terms of British Columbia. And long story short, the Liberal Party brass wanted a candidate who was endorsed by the leadership of the World Sikh Organization, a separatist group. So they shoved aside a more popular, secular, moderate candidate. And when we asked Trudeau about this, he said, well, that's democracy. Sometimes there are winners and sometimes there are losers in nomination battles, par for the course. The problem was that there was no democracy. The democratically chosen candidate was the one who was pushed aside by the party brass, which insisted that they substitute a candidate endorsed by the president of the World Sikh Organization. So Trudeau's reply that, well, this is democracy, indicated to me that he really didn't get what was happening. And in fact, one of his senior aides, his most senior aide, said to me at the time, well, Terry, I suppose you're going to do a story about the Sikhs taking over the Liberal Party. I thought, huh? We just put on television a picture of Sikhs, turbaned, Amritdhari, bearded Sikhs, walking out of the Liberal Party in protest of what the party brass had done. The story was about Sikhs leaving the Liberal Party in protest.
Right.
And he didn't get that. He thought the Sikhs were the ones who said they spoke for the Sikhs, not the ones who really did speak for the Sikhs.
Right. Don't you think Trudeau is using the alibi of free speech and speaking from conscience to hide his political compulsions? Even he seemed to suggest that even on his visit to Delhi.
Yes, that's a tricky question for this reason, that there's a big gaping hole in Canadian law. Trudeau is correct to say that under our system of freedom of speech, that there's nothing he can do if you walk down the street with a flag saying Khalistan Zindabad. That's not illegal. That's freedom of speech. Nothing wrong with that. The problem, and what I mean by the hole in Canadian law, as I see it, I'm not a legal expert, but I'm just a layman looking at what it says and what it does not say. And that is that there is nothing in Canadian law on hate speech about the glorification or incitement to terrorism. Now, most mature democracies have woken up to this long since. I mean, there are something like 30 countries in Europe who have legislation on this now. They've realized that this is a problem. You can't just have anything goes. You can't have people calling for the openly inciting terrorism on the streets of London or Berlin or Paris. And in London, for example, 17 years ago, they brought in legislation, the Terrorism Act of 2006, I believe, which says which makes a criminal offense out of the glorification of terrorism. Well, what do you call putting up the martyr posters that I've just described on the walls of a major Gurdwara where everyone can see it? What do you call it when you ride through the streets of Brampton on the back of a truck with a full life-size diorama, a tableau, celebrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984? Celebrating. That is what we have seen this year in Brampton, Ontario. And what do you call it when you make up posters with big red letters a foot high? Assassination, wanted. And in between the words assassination and wanted, you see the faces and the names of Indian diplomats who are identified as killers because apparently they are allegedly the authors of the death of the assassination of Mr. Hadi Nijjar in Surrey, British Columbia. Well, there is, of course, absolutely no evidence of any Indian involvement in the death of Mr. Nijjar, who died in a sort of gangland hit, as far as we know, between rival groups in Surrey. It sounds like the police have not declared themselves on this, but they have not made any connection with Indian foreign interference, as it's called, as though there was some sort of 007 hit squad of deadly diplomats roaming the world. I mean, they named the High Commissioner in Australia. The Indian High Commissioner in Australia is one of the killers, apparently. So did he fly a round trip 26,000 kilometers to Surrey, British Columbia, to help all the other diplomats kill Mr. Nijjar? I mean, it's ridiculous. But my point is that absent a law, which Canada needs, I believe, in this context, to make this sort of behavior criminal, the open incitement and glorification of terrorism, then Trudeau, I'm afraid to say, is quite correct to tell Mr. Modi, sorry, in Canada, it's freedom of speech. They can say what they like.
Right. How is it that the Sikh community punches so far above its demographic weight, despite being barely, about 2% of Canada's 40 million population? Sikhs are
it's about 750, 770,000 Sikhs.
Right.
They're not quite as numerous as the Hindus. The Indian diaspora in Canada is large. The Hindus are a little bit more numerous than the Sikhs, although you'd never know it. Most people would have told you, without consulting the last census, they would have told you the reverse. They would say, oh, well, most of the Indians in Canada are Sikhs. And that's because they are the loudest. They are the most organized. And by contrast, the rest of the Indian diaspora, to include moderate Sikhs who want no part of this Khalistani business, they basically don't want to get involved. The history of this, now, this may be changing now. So some people listening to what I'm about to say will say, well, he's a bit out of date. Fair enough. I do think there is a change developing as we speak. But most of the Indian diaspora that's not involved in the Khalistani business, they have prioritized getting their kids to school on time, getting to work on time, making a life for themselves in the new country. They don't want to get into fights, and they know that a fight is what they will get if they stick their heads up and they say a bad thing about the Khalistanis who've taken over the local Gurdwara, for example. So I think it's they haven't served themselves very well over the years, and they've now recently, only within the past couple of years, begun to catch on. Now I see a different attitude in among the for example, the Hindu associations, both in Canada and the United States, by the way. I'm speaking to the Hindu American Foundation this week, I believe. They have decided now that maybe we should get into the game and not just sit passively by while our good name is hijacked and implicitly dragged through the mud by Khalistanis who are making us all look bad by this glorification of terror.
Right. Is it possible for any Canadian Sikh politician to take an anti-Khalistan position and still be elected?
Well, yes, and that's what gives the lie to the myth that you've got to be a Khalistani if you want political success. I mentioned Ujjwal Dosanjh a moment ago, and his success. Well, he was elected and re-elected for 20 years in a heavily Sikh riding in British Columbia, while simultaneously steadfastly opposing Khalistani violence, for which he had paid the price personally, with 84 stitches in his head from a guy with an iron bar who tried to kill him back in the day, in I guess April of 1985. There have been in the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau a couple of ministers who have, let's say, played very nice with the Khalistanis. Both have not, let's say, shone as cabinet ministers. Navdeep Bains is no longer part of the government. Harjit Sajjan was demoted, I believe. But there was another member of parliament in the Liberal Party, not a cabinet minister, Ramesh Sangha, who was basically booted out of the Liberal caucus when he called out the Khalistanis elsewhere in the caucus, and called upon to take sides. In other words, the Liberal Party high command took sides with the Khalistanis against the guy pointing the finger at them. So he's no longer an MP. So I think that answers your question. You can and do get elected if you're good enough by being an anti-Khalistani. It's not a ticket to fame. But within the Liberal Party, it does seem that the Khalistanis certainly have some sway.
I see. Just last couple of things. You talk about since October 12, 1971, when an ad went up in the New York Times announcing the birth of the so-called Khalistan, which was laughable in itself even then to now. How do you track, what do you think is happening with the global scene when it comes to this movement?
Well, I think that the fact that it is only global in the sense that it's an international thing, but it's not a Punjab thing, I think that is the most significant aspect of the answer to that question. I think that until the millions of Sikhs who are proud Indians suddenly get the idea that they want an independent country, that the movement is going nowhere. Let me mention one statistic that it's another thing that people just don't know. I mentioned earlier the voting figures, which I think are rather persuasive in showing the pitiful level, the microscopic level of support for Khalistan within Punjab. Let me mention one other thing. The Pew Research Organization published this information a while back. As you know, they're the authors of a very large study of public opinion in India. They were in the field for months. The sample sizes are huge. They asked very deep and probing questions. And they discovered, for example, that 95%, I say again, 95% of Sikhs in Punjab said that they were, and I quote, very proud to be Indians. Now, you can't get, I don't know if you study the polling business at all, as reporters, we're always interested in polls. you can't get 95% for peaches and cream. I mean, nothing gets 95%.
True.
There's always more than 5% of people who object to anything. 70%, by the way, of those said that you can't be a real Sikh if you don't respect India. They said if you disrespect the nation of India, you're not a real Sikh.
Right.
70% of Sikhs in Punjab said that. And finally, one more that comes to mind, which I think is relevant in this conversation, and that is that the Pew Research people also divided the population of India by income. They divided them into 5 bands. 60% of Sikhs are in the top band,
Right.
far in excess of any other of the major religions in India. Far more. The others are around 20% of the population of Muslims or Hindus or Christians are in the top bracket for wealth. But
True.
60% of the Sikhs are. In other words, they're doing pretty well, and they sound pretty rational when they say, no, we don't want a breakaway country. And then they have to consider the final question, that is, okay, then what if? The what if question. What if we did have an independent country? What kind of country would this be, please? Would it be a theocracy? Well, I mean, judging by the people who are campaigning most vigorously in the diaspora for such a country, the answer is yes, it would be a theocracy. These people are, they're very keen, as many of the most militant groups were back in the day in the 1980s, at gunpoint, threatening people. If you don't endorse our fundamentalist, Puritan, Bhindranwale view of what Sikhism means, then we'll kill you. I mean,
Right.
people remember that. It happened to their families in Punjab. So I think that the fact that it is a global phenomenon and can be seen on TV screens in Australia or Germany or Canada it distracts us somewhat from the reality that millions upon millions of most Sikhs, where they live in Punjab, have no interest in an independent state.
Absolutely. To conclude, with Pakistan being in the doldrums now, do you think they have the stomach to continue to fund this movement in any way?
Well, I'm not persuaded that they do fund it, because I don't think they need to. Number one, Pakistan is broke. And number two, the diaspora is funding it generously. The referendum movement, the Khalistan movement is self-financing, but has always relied upon practical support. I don't mean money, from Pakistan. I mean, not just diplomatic cover, but safe haven,
Right.
Weapons, training, diplomatic support. Pakistan has always been the essential additive to the Khalistan movement ever since 71 and even before, because it serves Pakistan's interest to bleed India. It's a Pakistani strategic interest of long standing, is it not?
It is.
To get revenge for the 71 war and to have a buffer state between India and Pakistan, to cut off India's land access to Kashmir and so on, for their own strategic interest, not because they want the Sikhs to breathe free. I mean, look at how they treat Sikhs in Pakistan.
Right.
These are the great liberators of the Sikh people. Let me hear that again. So I think that the Pakistan, in as much as it's now becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of China, is going to continue to have the same strategic interests in supporting, at least rhetorically, the Khalistan movement.
Right.
But I don't see a strong interest on the Chinese side in maintaining that or adopting that agenda when it adopts Pakistan.
Right.
So I don't think it's going to make much difference to all of the factors that we've been discussing. I think it will still, the Khalistan movement is still, because of the referendum, running into a brick wall.
Before I let you go, do you personally face any threats because of your rather candid views?
Yes, I have for many years, and the difference being this, that in my case, if somebody comes to get me, it's not exactly going to be a mystery who did it. I'm not a very tempting target in that respect, because everybody knows who might be out to get me.
Right.
And there are many people who haven't been on TV for 40 years as I have, who are not so recognizable or so loud, but who face the same threats. Recently, for example, there was some kid with the National Sikh Youth Federation in the UK who tweeted a death threat against me. And there was somebody else on Twitter a couple of weeks ago saying, your time is coming, we're going to come and get you. And 20 years ago, they started by saying, well, we should find out where Milewski lives and put his head on a stick. And one of them said, well, bullets are cheap, it's Milewski's turn. And, so they make a fine noise.
Right.
But nowadays, the battle really is there's a little bit of lawfare that goes on, where they threaten lawsuits and sometimes even file lawsuits, but they never follow through. It makes noise so that they can then call a press conference and say, aha, you see, we're suing. And they always make sure to put a big number on it. We're suing Milewski for $136 million, they said at one point. That was their record number. Made me feel very important. But of course, the thing died out, and they eventually just abandoned it. And there was no case there. And eventually, that's the problem with the law, is eventually you have to produce some evidence. And if you don't have that, well, you're not going anywhere. And I would say that nowadays that's the main irritant rather than death threats. Although I have friends who suffer threats which are serious and come from people who seem to have a background in this kind of business, the business of threats and carrying them out, very thuggish threats. And I think in some cases they're more vulnerable than I am. And it's something that we should keep an eye on.
Right.
And that we'd all like to see a more aggressive attitude from police forces who generally say, oh yeah, sure, it's just talk. Well, in the Khalistan business, it's not always just talk, and there are bodies littering history to tell us that no, it's not just talk.